Hi, I'm Lisa DeLay, and I'm bringing you a short series on David Bentley Hart's interview with Peter Werner from the New York Times. I'm distilling it into nice, understandable chunks so we can all understand and benefit from it. Hell, universal salvation, and the character of God. Beauty, conscience, and what Christianity is actually about. Here's what we covered in this series. First, the uncanniness of Jesus, then the problem of evil, and the quandaries of hell. But I want to end here with what I think is the most consequential part of David Bentley Hart's perspective from the New York Times interview with Peter Werner, his thoughts on beauty, on moral conscience, and on what his faith has ultimately become. This episode is about what Christianity actually looks like when you strip away the institutional accumulations, the political weaponization, and even the fear. And get back to the center, the core of the gospel message and why it matters. Beauty is a theological category. David Bentley Hart makes a surprising argument, and he says that beauty is one of the most important categories in Christian thought. And he doesn't mean some vague aesthetic glamour. He means it, philosophically speaking, in a way that can radically change our thinking and our connection to God. He argues that there are certain transcendental orientations that every living mind has toward the good, the true, and the beautiful. These aren't mere preferences, they're the actual framework through which we judge everything else. And Hart says that of the three, beauty is actually the most revealing. Because goodness and truth can be explained away. You can say you love the truth because it gives you power. You can say you love goodness because it gets you social approval. But what about beauty? When you're genuinely desiring a painting, not as an investment, but for itself, there's no reductive explanation that fully accounts for it. Beauty points to something beyond itself. David Bentley Hart uses this example from the Gospel of John, the scene of Jesus before Pilate. To everyone in the ancient world, it would have been obvious Pilate had his glory, his eminence, his ultimate authority. He represents the superpower of Rome. He is, by the social hierarchy of the time, closer to the divine, especially how the Roman world was trained to see it. Jesus, by contrast, is a colonial subject, a peasant, a convict. No political, religious, or civil authority. Under the Roman law, he is non habes personam. He has no face before the law. He is a nobody. And yet Christianity inverts the framework completely. It finds that that person with nothing, in that nobody, is the face of God, the radiant beauty of the divine. Hart sees this as a revolution in how the Western world understands beauty, a spilling out of glory away from the powerful and the privileged and into the powerless, the wretched, the suffering, the forgotten. Your conscience is a theological tool. Here's where Hart gets to the best meat of the whole New York Times interview. Hart declares that faithful Christianity must not require suspending your moral intuitions whenever they seem to be in conflict with a biblical text, as it's been interpreted over time. He thinks that much of the historical framing imposed by empire gets this exactly backwards. He indicates that the earliest great interpreters of Scripture, both in Jewish rabbinic tradition and in the early Christian church, operated on the assumption that if a literal reading of a text is attributed to God, something that will be morally horrifying in a human being, that was a useful sign that the text required a deeper reading, not merely a literal one, and rather than a suspension of moral reasoning. Christian Father Origen said this too. Cappadocian Father Gregory of Nyssa said this explicitly, that God did not really slay the firstborn of Egypt. And to take it literally would be to ascribe to God something worse than the worst that human men can do. That contention that God can actually be morally inferior to sinful humanity is unreasonable and therefore absurd. Hart's argument that if the word good when applied to God means something entirely different from what it means when applied to a human being, if God can be good while commanding genocide, while consigning billions to eternal torture, then the word good has become completely empty. And an empty word cannot anchor a genuine kind of faith expression that Jesus initiated. Hart also does something specific with Romans 9 through 11. The famous passages about election and reprobation that reformer John Calvin used to build his doctrine of double predestination. Hart says that if you read those chapters in Romans as a whole, Paul actually ends up in exactly the opposite place. Not enough people have noticed this. The conclusion of Romans 11 is that all of Israel will be saved, that everyone has been bound in disobedience so that all might be shown mercy. All means all. These passages, people think, support predestination and eternal damnation by Paul himself, actually go in the direction of universal mercy by the end of Paul's argument. So what does faith look like in the end for David Bentley Hart? And now we get personal. This is the part of the interview with Hart that is the most potent. David Bentley Hart describes how his faith has shifted over time. He has become more indifferent to institutional and dogmatic authority. He's less bound by it, but not utterly dismissive of it. Knowing the actual history of how Christian doctrine developed, knowing how many contingent decisions and political pressures and mistranslations shaped what became orthodoxy, David Bentley Hart holds institutional claims more lightly now. But what has become more vivid to him, more central and more urgent, is something very specific. He describes translating the New Testament word by word from the Greek and encountering the text freshly, without the doctrinal inheritance filtering it. And what struck him was just how radical the social vision of Jesus actually is, and how it's been anemic over time. He gives the example of the Lord's Prayer. The word we translate as trespass in Greek, the word means debts, financial debts. Jesus is speaking into an economic crisis, paying off debt relief, praying that people don't get dragged into court and thrown into debtor's prison. It got distorted and turned into a vague moral sentiment that anyone, including the wealthy, can recite without discomfort and can disregard their responsibility in a new kingdom where Jesus is king. And Hart says what has become the center of his faith now is really simple. It's the line from Matthew 25, where Jesus says, "Inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it unto me." He says it this way. He has a burning sense of obligation to those whom this man Jesus loved. The poor, the marginalized, the strangers among us. And as Hart notes emphatically, that the New Testament is very clear. You will be judged by how you treat the strangers in your midst. I started this series because I thought Hart's interview in the New York Times deserved a distillation that could reach more people in practical ways for real-life issues. It's important to me to highlight the strangeness and the beauty at the heart of the spiritual movement that began with Jesus. And I don't have the same tolerance with the versions of it that have swapped the core message of Jesus for ideas that help people gain political power or even gain institutional comfort. Hart ends his interview with Peter Werner with a declaration. He says that if you can't square the character of God with basic moral coherence, if you have to use the word goodness and it becomes meaningless when it's applied to God, then you have something worse than bad theology. It's something he calls out as evil. And he says his one hope is to help people recover the sense that the innocence and goodness of God must be morally consistent. It must make sense. It can't be hidden behind the aims of authority. I can appreciate that, and I hope you can too. So which of the ideas from this series stuck with you the most? Has anything shifted in how you think about God or Jesus or Scripture? I read every comment. Please leave one.